beautiful people. I can say so, even though I'm one of them. You see, in October 1943, I was condemned to death. They saved my life.
The CBS television network presents Look Up and Live. Today, an act of faith. Part 1.
Yes, in 1943, I was condemned to death. My crime? Being a Jew. In other European countries, 6 million of us were murdered just because we were Jews. Here in Denmark, we were saved. 8,000 persons, 97% of the entire Jewish population of the country, were saved by our fellow Danes. It is one of the most remarkable escape stories of history. I know. I lived through it. The Germans invaded Denmark in 1940. Why did they wait until 1943 to try to liquidate the Danish Jews? They had been warned by their advisors here that the Danes had a long tradition of religious freedom. They had been warned that although the Danes were law-abiding and slow to anger, they would never tolerate the persecution of those fellow citizens that happened to be Jews. Christian X was King of Denmark at the time of the German occupation. He set the example. Daily during the occupation, the king rode through the streets of Copenhagen, defying German orders. When the subject came up of Jews having to wear the yellow Star of David, King Christian said that should the order be enforced, he and his entire family would wear it as a sign of the highest distinction. The yellow Star of David was never introduced in Denmark. By the fall of 1943, the Germans had decided that the price of 8,000 Jews was worth the risk of offending the Danes. This is Rabbi Melchior, Chief Rabbi of Denmark. The day before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, he received word that the Nazis were planning a roundup of the Jews.
It was my sad duty to give the message to the congregants and to ask everybody immediately to give this message to everybody, to family and to friends. And they were asked to go, also everybody, to non-Jewish friends and see how the things would be developed. In this way, it was possible to inform nearly the whole congregation in Copenhagen, so that only about 500 out of 7,000 Jews was arrested and deported. We all were saved to Sweden, as you know, and it is well known how nearly everybody in Denmark, directly or indirectly, was taking part in this work of saving. Not only because hatred to the Germans, but also as an act of friendship and love to their Danish Jewish fellow men.
My family and I were hidden by a railroad conductor who knew us, only because he punched my father's ticket daily on the railroad train.
My father went to the synagogue where Rabbi Melchior told him that something would happen and warned him, and then I went to some friends who hid me in a summer house in Snekkersten.
I was 15 years old and my sister was 13 and we were brought to a Catholic cloister where we were hidden.
My family, 6 persons at all, took a taxi to the middle of Zealand, and we were there in a little hotel 24 hours. From there we took back to Copenhagen and took another taxi to North Zealand, and a little fisher boat took us over to Sweden.
Why did our fellow Danes hide us? Why did they take the risk?
Well, it's a long time ago, but when you think, oh, it is just near. Well, it was naturally to help the people. They wanted help. They needed it against the Germans, the violence, all the terror of Hitler's regime came to Denmark. We wanted to fight against it, and how could we fight against it? Just with helping these people.
Simply because it was a human thing to do. And besides, I had so many good Jewish friends, I wanted to get out of the country.
You could take in some families, but you could take in all the families. And one day, you must know that the Germans would call at your home and ask, take all the families. And in the purpose to get these people to a more safe place, I, as well as a lot of other Danish people, had to find the way to send these people to Sweden.
That man, that mild-mannered man, Erik Petersen, became chief of the transportation for the evacuation. His best friend was killed helping to rescue the Jews. Petersen himself set out to find the 2 men that had betrayed his friend. Their identities were discovered, and on his orders they were shot to death. 8,000 Jews, protected by friends who could answer yes to the question, am I my brother's keeper? Of course, we couldn't stay hidden in the homes of friends forever. There was the question of food rationing. There was the danger of being detected. Sweden had generously offered us asylum, but how to reach Sweden? Here was one man who knew, Mr. Mogens Staffelt, a bookshop owner and during the war, resistance leader.
My shop being in the center of the town was quite convenient for the daily meetings of the resistance movement. And here's my good friend, Svend Troelsen, now a lawyer. During the war, living underground, he was chief of the Danish Navy and Army intelligence. In the early days of October 1943, the Danish resistance tried to get as many of the Jewish community as possible from their hidings to the docks and the sea coast where fishing boats were waiting for them. They were scattered all over Copenhagen, under the roofs, in the cellars, in hospitals, and in chapels, in small villages, and in summer huts. It was very important for the whole organization to have a central place for meetings, and Mr. Staffelt's shop became this central place. There were so many resistance people in his shop that it was more like a travel agency than like a bookshop. Yeah, so much that we were quite annoyed when somebody actually came to buy a book. The back room of Mr. Staffelt's shop became very important for the whole resistance movement. That is, until he was caught by Gestapo.
Until he was caught by the Gestapo and sent to a concentration camp. He managed to escape. His brother died there. This is Bispebjerg Hospital in Copenhagen. During the war, it combated a disease the Germans tried to introduce, anti-Semitism. Like all Danish hospitals, it's public and it's free. 2,000 Jews passed its gates on their way to Sweden. The Danish doctors and nurses that helped them charged no fee. This is Dr. Secker, chief anesthetist of Copenhagen University Hospital. During the war, he was a medical student. We asked Dr. Secker why he decided to get involved in the rescue operation of the Danish Jews.
Why did we get involved in this situation? We just had to. We got to know about some Jews that were cut off in a place where they couldn't get away from. The route was closed. And we just felt that we had to do something about this particular situation. That means some of my student friends and myself, we decided to go out to the hospital and get in touch with Dr. Karl Henrik Köster, who at that time was an assistant surgeon here in this hospital and who now is a chief surgeon in the same department. We knew that we could trust you and that you were able to cope with the situation. So we came out to you and explained that we had 40 Jews hide away someplace and that we would, or they would come out here the next day to the hospital. You had to take care of them and underbring them and get them away from here. So we found out at that meeting it would be possible to use the chapel here in the hospital, which was hidden fairly well away.
Yeah.
The entrance to the chapel was in the backyard of the hospital, and it would be possible to sneak them out from here.
You know, I think it's interesting to go here today once more where we had all these Jews coming into the hospital. They came up here this road, up to the chapel here.
Yes.
Where we had arranged that we could send them off by trucks from there. As far as I remember, I promised you 40 Jews should come out here, and then they could walk up here as they were going to a funeral, having bouquet of flowers in the hand, dressed up in a little black suit and so on. So it would look as it was really something natural going on.
Yes. And the gatekeeper phoned me, and he couldn't make out what they were doing here in the morning, because it's rather unusual to have a funeral in the morning.
As far as I remember, there were, I think I promised you 40, or was it 80?
No, it was 40.
But as far as I remember, there were more coming here.
Oh yes, many more. Because rumors got round that this was a place where you could turn to if you wanted to get out. And
how many had you?
I think about 140 instead of the 40 you said.
Was it really that many?
Yes.
I think now we have reached up to the chapel here, and this is a place in here where we kept the Jews when we got these 140 collected here. And I think this is your story, so it might be better if you told this story. So,
yes, I'll do that. We had so many refugees here that it was really a problem what to do next. With 140 people here, we had provided transport for only 40. And canvas-covered lorry drove up here to this place, and the passengers went in, and it was all well organized, and nobody seemed to take any notice of it. When the lorry drove out through one of the hospital gates, we saw a hand coming out through the slit in the canvas, waving to the people who were left behind. And we were a bit scared to see that, but we were still more scared when we noticed that a German Gestapo car, which was standing outside the hospital, apparently saw the lorry and started in a pursuit of it as far as we could see. And one of the
doctors who were working with us, Dr. Gammeltoft, jumped into his car and followed the two cars with the intention of ramming the German car, which he could easily make look like an accident. But fortunately, just at the very moment when he was about to ram the German car, it turned off along a different road, and the lorry proceeded to the port without any further incidents. But now we were still left with 100 people, and we had to find a place to keep them where the Germans and where the Gestapo would not get any suspicion of their being. And I approached the head nurse and asked her for some advice. She got hold of quite a few of her nurses, and about 40 of them asked the refugees to stay with them. This is the nurses' quarters, where the nurses of the hospital have their apartments, and where the refugees were taken in and spent the nights until they could be brought to the docks. And this is Nurse Jansen, who was one of the main persons in this part of the business, and she had the main responsibility for the organizing of the nurses. And why did you think you had to do that?
Jeg har altså fra mit hjem lært, at uden demokrati, der har man ikke...
Nurse Jensen says that she was brought up to believe in democracy and to believe that she had a strong responsibility as well, and that you have got to fight for preserving the democracy. And as to helping the Jews, she says that she had been engaged in illegal work from the very beginning, from April 1940, when the Germans occupied Denmark, and that she thought that she had a responsibility for the Jews as well, not so much for the people being Jews, as because they were countrymen who needed her help. It happened several times that the Germans attacked the hospitals where refugees and Jews were brought in when they had been wounded and were taken for treatment. So it wasn't quite without risk to the doctors and the nurses to assist the refugees. Sometimes they killed the victim, the patient, and also some of the doctors, and that actually happened in this hospital where one of my friends was murdered in that way. So now you see the theater building of this hospital here, and you see some steps which are fixed to the wall. And these steps made it possible to escape through this window if the Germans kept all the stairs and doors closed so that you couldn't get out in a normal way. Now, when the refugees were in the nurses' quarters, the next problem was to get them onto the boats, to get them to the docks. And one of the most reliable and useful men who were employed in this part of the work was the ambulance driver, Mr. Knudsen. And he was able to transport 17 or 18 people in the old ambulance, which you see here.
Jeg vil hjælpe folk denne gang.
Mr. Knudsen said that to him it wasn't a question of Jew or not Jew. It was just a question of countrymen being in distress whom he wanted to help to escape from the Gestapo. And that he did, and he brought the refugees from the nurses' home to the docks in a great many runs in his ambulance.
These are the docks. The man you are looking at is at present a manufacturer of scientific instruments. During the war, while in his early 20s, Ole Lippmann escaped to England. There he received special training in sabotage, was commissioned a major, and dropped by parachute back into Denmark. His underground activities have earned him a place of honor in the history of our country.
A great number of Jews left for Sweden in fishing boats. The fishing boats left either from Copenhagen harbor itself or from small towns up along the coast. Places of embarkation had to be changed constantly because of the German patrol boats. But the patrol boats themselves were not the only danger. The Germans used dogs, police dogs, to find the human cargoes hidden on the ships. To overcome this difficulty, scientists developed a concoction of human blood mixed with cocaine, which dulled the senses of the dogs.
Here is one man who escaped from the Nazis and their dogs.
It is right here. I'm talking with my wife and my children to Sweden. The Germans has been here with their dogs, and I have, and my family have hiding us in this house and this side. And 11 o'clock, they were jumping in a fisher boat and take to Sweden.
As all the Scandinavian people, the Danes are a seafaring nation. And it was quite natural for us to organize the boat transports across the Sound. But there were many accidents. Right here, for instance, at this very spot, Blichfeldt Møller and Christiansen got killed organizing a transport to Malmö. In the early part of October, a great number of the Danish Jews lived in fear, in hiding. They knew the fate of Jews from other countries of Europe. They knew that the Jews of Norway had been exported to Germany, been sent to concentration camps and extermination, and they were, of course, very terrified of what went on here. Some, unfortunately, committed suicide. Two sisters threw themselves against a trolley in the streets of Copenhagen, and one famous young Danish scientist wanted to kill himself and his family and slit the throat of his children, killed his wife, and while trying to kill himself, got scared and ran away into the streets. And I can mention this man is still alive today. There were, of course, a few incidents like this, but very few indeed, because very soon the Danish Jews learned that their fellow countrymen were anxious to help them.
Ole Lippmann was ready to help them. Danish fishermen were ready to help them. And Danish doctors and nurses and ambulance drivers. Businessmen and students, the police, members of the armed forces. And the church, the Danish Lutheran Church. No man was more outspoken than Pastor Ivar Lange. In the fall of 1943, he addressed a group of confirmation candidates in Frederiksberg Church. He said,
I will prefer to die with the Jews rather than to live with the Nazi.
On October 3rd, 1943, the Danish Lutheran bishops drafted a letter that was sent to the German occupation officials. In addition, it was read in every Lutheran church in Denmark. Reading it now is Pastor Helms.
Persecution of the Jews conflicts with the humanitarian conception of the love of neighbors and the message which Christ's church set out to preach. Christ taught us that every man has a value in the eyes of God. Persecution conflicts with a judicial conscience existing in the Danish people, inherited through centuries of Danish culture. All Danish citizens, according to the fundamental law, have the same right and responsibility under the law of religious freedom. We respect the right to religious freedom and to the performance of divine worship according to the dictates of conscience. Race or religion should never in themselves cause people to be deprived of their rights, freedom, or property. Notwithstanding our separate religious beliefs, we will fight to preserve for our Jewish brothers and sisters the same freedom we ourselves value more than life. The leaders of the Danish Church clearly comprehend the duties of law-abiding citizens, but recognize at the same time that they are conscientiously bound to maintain the right and to protest every violation of justice. It is evident that in this case we are obeying God rather than man.
The Jews were in hiding. The Germans couldn't find them. Some had already made their way safely to Sweden. Furious, the Germans arrested top Danish army and navy officers and offered to release them in exchange for Danish Jews. The officers refused. Major General Goetz and Vice Admiral Wedel, chiefs of the Danish army and navy, issued a statement to the effect that they could see no point in exchanging one Dane for another Dane. Voluntarily, they remained in an internment camp at Elsinore. How the Danes got virtually the entire Jewish population safely to Sweden, the effect of this on the Danish resistance movement, and what happened to the Danish Jews after the war when they returned to Denmark, we'll show you next week on part 2 of the story of Denmark's heroic rescue of the Jews during the Second World War.
CBS Television Network has presented Look Up and Live. Today, An Act of Faith, Part 1. Next week, An Act of Faith, Part 2. Look Up and Live has been a public affairs presentation of CBS News. This program was produced in Denmark.
Hello, my name is Harry Katlev. I'm a Danish Jew. You're looking at actual films of Danish Jews fleeing Denmark in October 1943. Not all of them made it. 6 members of my own family drowned in a boat very much like this one, halfway to Sweden.
The CBS CBS Television Network presents Look Up and Live. Today, An Act of Faith, Part 2.
In the fall of 1943, the Nazis decided to liquidate Denmark's Jews. 8,000 of us, 97% of the Jewish population of Denmark, were saved by our fellow Danes. Last week we saw how almost the entire population of Denmark acted as one underground movement to save us from the Germans. In a matter of hours we were hidden in the homes of Gentile friends, and the next step was to get us to Sweden. In some areas, such as Elsinore, the distance between Denmark and Sweden is very narrow. In other places, it is much wider. Because of German patrol boats, the places of embarkation had constantly to be changed. We are now 25 miles north of Copenhagen. We are in Elsinore, scene of Shakespeare's Hamlet. This is the famed old castle of Elsinore. From here, the crossing to Sweden is only 2.5 miles, but the currents are swift and often treacherous. You're looking at the Swedish coastline as seen from Elsinore. On a clear day, it looks even closer. It takes the ferry boat only 20 minutes to make the crossing. Now it's a simple crossing. In October 1943, it was more difficult. There was the Gestapo, there were German patrol boats, and still there were men that risked their lives to see that these crossings were made. Here is one of them.
My name is Tormod Larsen. I am Detective Sergeant by Foreign Office in Elsinore. During the war, I was a member of the underground called Elsinore Sewing Club. One of my jobs was to carry out small youth children to our boats which arrived from Sweden and take care of that they don't cry up because it was so dangerous and we have the risk that the German Gestapo immediately would come and take us.
When the Germans found Danish doctors treating Jewish refugees, they would usually murder both doctor and patient. Still, this did not dissuade Danish doctors from playing their part in the rescue of their Jewish countrymen.
This is a house in Snekkersten where I lived during the war in 1943. And down here is the water, and only 2 miles from here is Sweden, where the Jews want to escape. The fishermen who would help the Jews to get over to Sweden came to me and asked me to give the children injections because they were afraid that the children would scream and cry in the night and call the Germans. And I gave the children nearly 100 injections, so they slept and were quiet, and all of them came safe over to Sweden.
I was one of the children who was sailed over to Sweden from places like up here near Elsinore. My parents left in October 43, and one of my father's good friends, Blichfeldt Møller, one of the underground heroes, he was killed in 44 later on. He took me up to Elsinore and left me with Captain Kjær. And here is Captain Kjær.
Jeg husker dem godt. De var en af de jødedrenge, som jeg sejlede over sundet. De blev bragt med ombord. Indsprøjtning fik de ikke, da de var rolige nok. Jeg sejlede dem til Helsingborg, hvor de blev overladt til deres far, som var lykkelige.
Captain Kerr says that he remembers me very well. I didn't get any injections because he told me to keep quiet, and I did. And he left me with my father in Helsingborg. Mr. Kerr, how did you get involved in all this? Hvordan kom de ind i det der?
Ja, vi begyndte på overfarterne, fordi at tyskerne var gået lidt for langt. De begyndte at forgribe sig på den danske befolkning, jødebefolkningen. Af idealistiske grunde startede vi. Senere blev der sport for at se, hvor meget og hvor længe vi kunne narre tyskerne.
Yeah. Mr. Captain Kerr says that right from the beginning of the occupation, he saw the terrible German behavior here in Denmark, and he felt that he ought to do something. So he got involved with these illegal routes to Sweden, and after a little while it became sort of a sport, and he wanted to try and see how many times he could fool the Gestapo.
The people of Elsinore have every right to be proud of their bravery during World War II. It was a bravery not without mishap. During a German raid on this area, Captain Kerr was captured by the Germans, and Detective Larsen was shot and severely wounded by them. In the nearby church of Gilleleje, 80 Danish Jews hid in the attic, awaiting transfer to the fishing boats along the shore. An informer tipped off the Germans, and 43 of the refugees were captured. They never reached Sweden. The rest managed to escape to the woods. The woods offered these refugees an ideal shelter, and they hid in them not only around Gilleleje, but up and down the Danish coast. It was difficult for the Germans to find them. It was also difficult for the resistance, and the resistance had to find them to tell them of the boats that were ready to take them to Sweden. Arne Sejer, resistance hero.
Seeking cover or hiding in the woods were a natural thing for all those Jews who didn't have any friends to go to. I myself were, during the war, the leader of the students' resistance movement. I had been wounded and were brought down to a place in South Zealand, to an estate where I was placed in order to recover after the wound. That place was situated close to the woods, and it therefore became natural a contact point for collecting all those Jews which were found in the woods after some friends of mine which had gone through the woods and combed them for refugees. When they were found, they were brought to this contact point, and from there brought down through the woods to the beach to a fisher boat. This fisher boat were bought by the owner of the estate, who were a very good man who took active part in the resistance, and also economically in other ways tried to help, and especially in this situation with the Jews, where he bought the boat immediately when it was needed, and from this boat all the Jews which had fled to the woods and which we found were brought in safety to Sweden.
My name is Etty Henriques, and my family are like Danish Jews, and they date back to the 17th century in this country. Most of my family living in Copenhagen, but my parent had a farm, and he thought when warned, well, nothing will happen here, only in Copenhagen. So we stayed after the warning, but in the middle of the night, the telephone rang, and a man saying, "This is Jensen speaking." This was the head of the police my father knew, and he wanted to know were we still there or had we left. So we left for the night, and we fled up into the woods. Old people, babies, and everybody. And after a while, we found the way through the woods back to the house where we were in. Then when it got dark, we got in a fisher boat. We had to climb down and got into it. And it sailed out, and sailed in a big bend round a German watch ship. And we got along to Sweden, where the policemen took very well hand of us.
This is the harbor at Klintholm, a well-known fishing village about 70 miles south of Copenhagen. During October 1943, the fishing boats here carried an unusual cargo: Danish Jews trying to escape the Nazi persecution. It was in this area that two of the most remarkable men in the Danish resistance movement were based: Erik Stærmose and Ole Helvig.
In the fall days of 43, things became critical between the Danes and the Germans. I was a lieutenant in the Danish Navy at that time. We scuttled the submarines where I served on Holmen in Copenhagen, and was imprisoned by the Germans. We were, after a short imprisonment by the Germans, I came into the underground movement, and being seagoing, I went into the ferrying business between Denmark and Sweden. The ground was rather hard at that time, and especially because the Germans were rounding up the Danish Jews, and we decided to start out a route from Denmark to take out the Danish Jews, or Danish countrymen. And when things became too hard at home, I went to Sweden, and together with my good friends Ole Helvig and architect Ben Karlby and the German Jewish fisherman Erik Marx, we succeeded in making up a team with a fishing boat, one just like the boat we are sitting on now, and a couple of fast-going Chris-crafts. And the first times we went over, things weren't working out as easy as I tell it now. We were a little bit scared. We didn't know how many guards the German had on the shore. And
there was one down here, you remember?
Yes, but
they pinched his gun and made him dead drunk.
Yes, I don't especially know him. I worked from the seaside, so it was more of your business to keep him out of the picture. But anyway, after a while, it was better organized and worked automatically, I should say. As I said, it wasn't so easy at that time as I tell about it now. But anything went out all right until the 10th of December. Still remember that night, a very clear night with a full moon. And we went out from Sweden with Ole Helvig and Erik Marx and myself as a crew. Do you remember that night?
Oh, sure, I do. Well, it went on beautifully until the end of December 1943. Then we were caught, and it happened this way that we had to go over one very moon-clear evening. Orders from Stockholm. We had an organization now working up there, and it was a very bad trip because there was a patrol boat waiting in the shadow of big trees close to the shore, and we didn't have a chance. We were taken aboard their boat, but before that we had a chance to eat our Danish papers, identification papers. Tasted very badly, but we got them down, and we had papers on the boat as Swedish fishermen, and we kept them. They were taken to Copenhagen, the Gestapo prison, and it worked quite nice. Erik Marx, who was a German Jew and refugee from Germany, could speak after a few months fluently Swedish, and so could I, but you couldn't, Erik. So we had to make you an idiot. I knew a little about that because my father was a doctor for that kind of diseases, and I told you how to hang down your mouth like that. I think you can still do it. Come on.
Well, if I'm trying hard, I can.
Okay. So you didn't have to say a word. We did the talking, and after a couple of weeks, they finally did believe us and saw that we were Swedish fishermen just out for money. And so they try to buy us and say, well, if you get refugees and cargo another time, why not take it to us? We will pay more. And we say, well, that's a good idea. If you let us go home with our own ship, we'll try to do that. So they let us out, and we went home to Sweden with a ship. And of course, we didn't live up to that part of the deal, where the ship went on sailing for the rest of the war and transported a lot of more people.
Erik Stærmose and Ole Helvig. They worked full-time for the resistance movement. They risked their lives. The only payment they received was the satisfaction of knowing that they personally were responsible for saving about 750 of their countrymen. There are as many escape stories as there were crossings, and there were about 1,000 crossings. In some cases, it was a question of a few minutes in a fast speedboat. In other cases, it was a question of many hours in crowded, uncomfortable quarters.
My crossing took many hours. At the end of 43, in October, I had to flee with my girl twins, Marianne and Birgit. They were 1.5 years old then. And they had to get injections in order to keep them quiet during the crossing. We came by a little rowing boat with an outboard motor, which didn't work so long. So we had to row, and we were rowing for hours and hours. Suddenly, the injection didn't have any effect anymore to Marianne. So she began to scream. 2 of the men who were afraid that the screaming of Marianne would cause that we were discovered by the German patrol boats, ordered to have her thrown overboard. But of course I refused to this. And then one of the men in the boat took her from my arms and shuttled her inside his coat until she was unconscious. So we were rowing again for hours, and we were tired and low down spirited. Suddenly, a boat appeared, and we took the chance that it might be a Swedish one. And fortunately, it was a Swedish one. We were taken into the boat and came to a little Swedish town where Marianne was rushed to the hospital. And she was more dead than alive for several days. Even today, she is still sick because of the trouble she has gone through.
Ole Lippmann, a leader of the Danish underground.
At the end of October 1943, almost all Danish Jews had been transported to Sweden. The Danish resistance movement gained an impetus from this enormous transport organization. The Danes, being peace-loving and easygoing people, had been a bit reluctant for many years in taking active part in resistance movement, even if the resistance movement had been growing all along the time. When this happened to the Jews, when people had to hide friends, relatives, and people they knew, they had already taken the first step, and from there on, the resistance movement grew enormously. During the month of November, the greatest number of sabotage actions which ever took place in Denmark took place. And the German Gestapo chief, Boven-Sieben, wrote in his report to Germany at the end of December 1943 that the Danish resistance movement had become greater because of the German effort to arrest the Danish Jews. At the end of the war, Field Marshal Montgomery mentioned that the Danish resistance movement was second to none.
In April 1945, the war ended. 1 month later, the Danish Jews returned to their country. This is Rabbi Melchior, Chief Rabbi of Denmark.
It has happened before that a population of a country let the Jews go to another country, and perhaps they have been happy to get rid of them. But it should be known, and I want to say it in this hour, that the greatest thing has been the hearty welcome from the whole population, from the king and from everybody in Denmark, that we returned.
I just want to tell you how we went back from Sweden after being 20 months living there as displaced persons. When we came back, a wonderful summer day in July, our maid, who has been with us many years, was staying at the quay and waiting for us. She was there together with her sisters and all their children, and they were waving with their flags.
The Danish flags.
The Danish flags, and then they welcomed us, and we went with them at home in her home.
Denmark's rescue during the Second World War of almost its entire Jewish population is matched by no other country. There is no one answer to the question, why? There are many answers. We'll never know all of them. If we could, we might be able to solve the problem of man's inhumanity to man. Surely one answer lies in Denmark's geographical proximity to neutral Sweden and the fact that Sweden willingly accepted all refugees who reached its shores. The courage of King Christian X, of the church, of the medical profession, of the students' groups, of the business organizations, surely must have inspired the populace to follow suit. We must also consider Denmark's long tradition of democracy. As early as in 1690, the concept of the ghetto was condemned by the Danish parliament as inhuman. In 1814, all racial and religious discrimination was declared illegal in Denmark. Perhaps democracy and humanitarianism go hand in hand. Whatever the reasons for the Danes' heroic action, what they did is the embodiment of religious belief, conviction confirmed by deed, the true act of faith.
His Excellency Yehuda Harry Levin, Ambassador from Israel to Denmark.
I was in Israel during a large part of the Eichmann trial. At the beginning of it, for about 3 weeks, we heard the unrelieved story of a Nazi bestiality in countries like Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and others. For some of our people, it was reliving an experience, an anguish, through which they had themselves lived and somehow survived. Others had lived close to it, but had not themselves experienced it. And for a large part of our people, those born in Israel especially, it was an experience which they couldn't grasp. It was a kind of incredible story, a nightmare that was beyond their understanding, although it was still a terrible nightmare to them. All these people were in a state of depression through those early chapters of evidence at the Eichmann trial. And then one day, quite unexpectedly, a new chapter was unfolded. And that was the story of the rescue of the Jews of Denmark. It came like a beam of sunlight into a darkened world. It showed how men, people, simple people, could be brave and courageous and human and brotherly in circumstances of great peril to themselves. It was a chapter which the Jewish people will never forget. And for Israel, in its relations with Denmark, it is one of those links that are forged among peoples of the world only too rarely in history.
On October 11, 1960, the American Jewish community presented a silver menorah to King Frederick IX and Queen Ingrid of Denmark. It is engraved with these words: "With everlasting thanksgiving to the throne and people of Denmark for saving with heroic determination the entire Jewish community of their country. For opposing the Nazi tyranny, over 3,000 members of the Danish resistance were murdered by the Germans. Those who died in Germany were put into a common crematorium. After the war, the ashes were placed into urns, such as this one, and distributed to relatives and friends. At this spot in Copenhagen, 199 corpses of Danish resistance fighters were found and identified. It has been turned into a memorial park, consecrated with these words from the Old Testament: "You stand here on holy ground."
The CBS television network has presented Look Up and Live. Today, An Act of Faith, Part 2. Look Up and Live has been a public affairs presentation of CBS News. This program was produced in Denmark.
This program was pre-recorded. Officially speaking, Trinity College offers the challenge to the champion Bobcats of Bates in today's GE College Bowl. But unofficially, you can challenge both.